You know, it was a ship that ran up and down the West Coast for 40 odd years, from 1913 to 52. And all the communities, well, most of the communities out there had no other access to goods and services, and the Maquinna provided all that. And it was kind of like a rural bus line, because it went up the coast every 10 days and it pulled into all the towns. People, boat day was big, everybody showed up at the dock, and you know, when they were on the boat, they had the same kind of luxury as all the Princess boats had, you know, dining rooms and stuff, and, you know, cabins when they can get them. And so they became very attached to the boat, and they became very attached to the crew, because the captain and their officers always sat at the tables with the people. And rather than sitting on a table by themselves, so they mixed with them. And they used to have dances on the boat, and they used to, you know, some nights they'd stop in Tofino and have a dance in the community hall, and the ship would stay overnight, you know. So there was a great sort of camaraderie and connection with the boat. So when I started doing the research on it, I discovered there were lots of articles about the Maquinna, but there never was a book. After reading all these articles and the quotes that people had in there, I've decided to call it the best loved boat, because it was so, the people were so attached to it that, you know, it had a special place in their lives. It was going up and down that stretch of water without radar or anything, and the book I delve into, you know, how did they handle it in fog, and how did they handle it in heavy weather, and, you know, but you know, it bumped into rocks now and again, and there's a few of those are mentioned in the book, but it never came to grief. It never ended up, you know, having a disaster. And there were, as you say, it was the graveyard of the Pacific, and if you got bad weather out there, you had to know what you were doing. They couldn't land. There was no pier, because it was rocky and there was waves coming in, and so they had to offload into First Nation canoes and then paddle to shore. And it was a great excitement whenever this happened, because the boats were tipping over, stuff like that, and things were getting wet and going in the water. So passengers on the boat were intrigued by all this, watching this carry on. The thing about the Maquinna was that it was, while it ran, and it was, you know, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, but then the war came, and then things started to change, because the airplanes, after the war, airplanes were far faster. You know, Queen Charlotte Airlines was flying. You could fly to Tofino in a half an hour instead of taking a 2-day boat ride. So, I mean, the writing was on the wall at that stage, and eventually the boiler gave out on the ship, and the CPR decided, no, we're not going to renew it. And that was sort of the beginning of the end of all the Princess liners, because they were all getting to be 30, 40 years old at that stage, and they were basically running out of steam, as you say. And so they were all scrapped, or various things happened, and the Maquinna ended up being a barge that was towed ore from Alaska down to Tacoma, and eventually it was scrapped altogether. I think it's a story that people in BC should know about. You know, it's interesting that, you know, of late the road to Tofino has been shut because of things, and people have brought up, wow, we wish we had the Maquinna back. At least it was reliable. So, yeah, it was called Old Faithful and Old Reliable, because you know, they could pretty well count on it. And an interesting little story was that they knew when the boat was coming, or the Vancouver province had a radio station, and they used to have a guy named Kelly. And this guy Kelly was an Irish Australian, and he was very polished, and he always finished his broadcast with the news every night, and he'd say, and good night to all those on the Maquinna, which is now off Ucluelet or something. And then everybody could figure out, okay, if it's in Ucluelet now, it'll be in Tofino then, and it'll be in, you know, Wahauset, and then it'll be in wherever, Nootka by such and such, so that everybody could gauge it by listening to the radio and listen to Kelly, and Kelly would tell them where the boat was.
Set your watches by.
Oh yeah, well, yeah. But, you know, I mean, I mean, storms would hold it up, or fog, you know. They weren't stupid about it. I mean, they didn't pile it in, you know, and go in the worst of weather. If it got really bad, they would pull her in for a while, you know, and wait for the storm to go away. You or I wouldn't have been connecting with the First Nations, because they weren't allowed inside the ship. They were on the bow, or they were allowed in the hold in wintertime, but they weren't allowed into the main part of the ship. Interesting, but yeah, it was just part of the tenor of the time. You have to tenor that with the times and about the way things were. But
And judge it by the standards.
And judge it by the standards of today, exactly. But you know, there are still boats that you can go on and experience the kind of thing that was like to go on the Maquinna. You can take the U-Chuck out of Gold River and it goes up to Nootka. There's another one out of Campbell River called the Aurora, and it goes up through the Broughtons and up to Bella Bella. 5-day trip on that one. It's not the same as getting on a cruise ship in Vancouver and going to Alaska. I mean, they're smaller boats and they still offload goods. You know, they have the cranes going, so when you pull into a logging camp, you know, they're offloading spools of wire and diesel oil, all the stuff they need. That's exactly what the Maquinna did. You know, it offloaded stuff, and it had doors on the side of the ship that they opened up. And if say there was some logger, a Jippo logger on his own, he would row out in his rowboat and he'd wait for the Maquinna, and then they'd stop the boat and open the gate, open the doors, and load down whatever he needed. The ship used to go to Vancouver and load up Woodward stuff, you know, and they would load the ship up with that and then come back to Victoria, pick up passengers, and then back up the coast again. All the whaling stations and the pilchard stations, pitcher reduction plants that were on the coast, and canneries and stuff, they carried a lot of that stuff. Yeah, eventually what happened was that canneries and stuff got their own boats, and a lot of the fishing moved to Steveston, and so yeah, by the 50s the writing was on the wall that it wasn't going to last much longer. But it's a good story for the time that it was there.